I feel really strange up here after talking about mathematics for 45 years. This is my first non-math talk ever given, and so I apologize if it doesn't go okay. I'm going to try and tell you a story about the history of wrestling as a sport, and secondly, a history of Bellingham and how it sort of wanted to become known in the world, and they sort of tie together. And there's many interesting characters I'm going to talk about. At the end, I'll tie all the characters together. Along the way, I guarantee you'll get lost because a lot of wrestlers came to Bellingham. Secondly, there's going to be a hint of scams along the way. You try and pick up the hints, and at the end, I'll try and tie the scam together. And the third is there's a lot of information I've omitted. Originally, I started out with 250 slides for this presentation, so I knew I had to cut down some. But it turns out that there's fascinating descriptions in newspapers of each of these matches, and I can't include all of that. I'll tell you the moral of the story at the start, which is Bellingham people were scammed financially, but they didn't care. As the side benefits were worth it. So that's going to be the goal. So, I moved here in 1984, and so I missed part of this, but I remember seeing some of the ads. Some of you might remember some of these people. Hulk Hogan, Macho Man, Ric Flair, The Sheik. I believe two of those are deceased at this particular time. But some of you might recognize Gene Knitsky, who lived in Blaine, and he also played football for the Edmonton Oilers, I believe, at the time, or the Eskimos, whatever they were. I have to introduce some of the old wrestling styles. You may not be familiar with all of them. The one I'm going to talk the most about tonight is the catch-as-catch-can. It turns out that's the style of professional wrestling today. It basically means catch me any way you can, and we can wrestle from there, is what it really means. The collar and elbow is the one that's in the sort of lower right there. They wore a harness and they would have to hold onto the collar and the elbow and try and twist the person over. The Cumberland back hold is the one on the right, where you'd have two people grab a hold of each other's back and you had to try and throw the person off balance. And the Greco-Roman is still used in the Olympics today. The rules were basically that you had to pin the person, and that was a 2-point pin, means that your shoulders had to touch the mat. And it was governed by something called the Police Gazette Rules, which is the magazine on the right. And it's an old magazine that basically was, usually the covers had half-draped women on it. You know, it was sort of an interesting magazine. People eluded state laws by exhibitions. You weren't supposed to have public wrestling matches, so what they did is they said, this is an exhibition, it'll be scientific, and they had music programs, they had vaudeville along with it. So that way they got around the rules of wrestling. Anything was allowed. Those are all the possible moves. You'll see in the upper right a picture, this is from France, of the different holds. It turns out there's more than 1,000 holds that are associated with the catch-as-catch-can. The only legal hold was a strangle hold or the choke hold. You'll see what a strangle hold looks like. And that was the only one that was outlawed. And you're going to see that that has a strong role in what I'm going to talk about tonight. So keep going, please. Wrestling basically started because of circuses. Circuses and vaudeville shows would travel across the United States and stop in small towns. I recognize this because I was raised in a town of a farming community of 300 in Minnesota. Circus would come to town and I would go to the wrestling tent. And they would have a person come out in front, this big brawny person, challenge anybody in the neighborhood to fight. And all of a sudden some farmer from some town 50 miles away would raise their hand and say, I'll fight you. What we didn't know that he was a ringer who was part of the circus. You know, the town was always 50 miles away type of thing, so we wouldn't know him. Well, that's exactly what happened here, is they had ringers who followed him around and actually put a bad name to wrestling. And also these wrestlers had a special thing called a hook. Is all of a sudden if they're facing somebody who looked like they were a good wrestler or really knew what was going on, they'd use their hook to get rid of them quickly. And that was sort of like a stranglehold. I'll let you read this. It turns out championship wrestling was the same as championship walking. At that time, they would walk for 6 days straight. They'd have a cot along the track. They could sleep 3 hours a day. Otherwise, they had to walk. And people would bet on them. Who's the first person who drops out? Who's the first person who walks 100 miles and stuff like that? And it became very illegal as well because people would start chewing coca leaves, coca leaves, and that way they could last longer and so forth. And so a lot of betting was illegal with it, and so it got a bad name. You'll see the Anacortes newspaper. Notice that's 1883, the Anacortes newspaper. This is the first guy we're going to talk about. He'll show up couple times in the program. His name is J.H. McLaughlin. His weight changed depending upon how old he was when he wrestled. That's him at age 50. He was wrestling in Seattle, and it was two big meets. The one on the left was with a guy named Moth, M-O-T-H. They had fought 10 years earlier. The fight started at 9 p.m. and it ended at 3 a.m. and they called it a draw. So if you can imagine fighting for 6 hours. Oh, it turns out in that particular match, it turns out that Moth won. Then on the right is a guy against a guy by the name of John Benjamin, and they were both over 50 when they fought. And nobody came to the match. Only about 10 people were in the audience. And so Seattle just basically closed up wrestling at that time. Now, why Whatcom? Well, one is that it was a population of 23,000 at that time. In fact, they did an official census in the middle of January of 1904. There were ample purses inside betting money because there was a lot of mining, logging, and fishing. People had lots of money. It turns out wrestling followed mining communities. There were a lot of spectators. They had access to Vancouver. They had access to Seattle. They had access to Spokane. And that was the larger audience. Even Portland would come up for some of their meets or matches. There was what's called a consolidation frustration because Bellingham and Fairhaven merged to become Bellingham in December of 1903. So for the first part of the story, from basically April through the end of 1903, it was Whatcom where all the meets were held. And then the first big match was held in Bellingham in 1904, and the newspaper reporters all across the United States could not figure out why all of a sudden Whatcom became Bellingham. And there was a lot of frustration. Plus, they didn't know how to spell Whatcom. Whatcom was spelled W-H-A-T-C-O-M-B. There's always a B at the end. Okay. The other reason for Bellingham is because of the Beck Theater, which is in the left there. It was a big theater where the old pennies used to be on Magnolia and Cornwall. And you'll see the stage inside. It was just a fantastic building. It held 2,200 people. It was an opera house. It was the largest opera house on the West Coast, west of Chicago at that particular time, bigger than anything in San Francisco. And Joseph Beck is the person on the right who built it. He was the person who had the Bellingham Bay Brewery, not the one that's today, but he had a Bellingham Bay Brewery that lasted for 1 year, made a lot of money. And then he used his money, $155,000, to build this theater. And it was just a fantastic place. You'll see the upper right is now you'll see what it looks like when you're in the audience looking down at the stage, because that's where the wrestling occurred. There's the legislature in Washington in 1903 was very, they tried to outlaw everything. You'll notice that businesses had to close on Sunday. You had a $10 fine if you were caught giving somebody a haircut. The fourth one, if you're a woman appearing in public in male attire, unless you were on your way to or from a masquerade party, you got a ticket. I mean, they had all kinds of things. But they had the gambling as well. But it turns out that gambling on wrestling was okay because of, in 1902, in Hartford, Indiana, a judge had ruled that gambling on wrestling was not the same as gambling in a gambling environment. So therefore, it was okay. Okay, the Ringling Brothers Circus came to Bellingham every year, starting in about 1888 is the last I think I found. And this is in 1890. They had a big parade when it came to town. The guy on the right is Halmer Lundin from Sweden. He was a strongman who traveled with the circus. And he was in Bellingham in 1894 and 1895, the strongman. He also was a wrestler if you challenged him, but they would put a great big board across his, he'd lay down on the floor and put a great big board across him on his chest. And 30 people, 15 on each end, would sit on it, and they'd seesaw on top of him. He would lift a 600-pound part of a car axle and lift it in the air. He would lift a grand piano on his back and carry it across the stage. He did all kinds of things. He was known as a strongman. The reason he's important is his protege who worked with him when he quit the circus was a guy named John Berg. He's also a strongman out of Chicago. And he worked with Halmer Lundin, traveling throughout the Midwest, putting on strongman shows. They'd go into the area and they would dare the community, we can outlift you. And so all these, and I should say that John Berg spent most of his time up in Virginia, Minnesota, up in the mining community up there. On the left, you'll see some of the strongman acts. It's not John Berg. And on the right, they actually did lift horses. They would lift other animals as well as part of the strongman act. This is from the 1903 directory for Bellingham. You'll notice John Berg, wrestler, rooms at the Beck. Can you imagine listing your occupation as a wrestler in 1903? So we're to the first match. It was a guy by the name of Chris Person against this John Berg. Now, I got to tell you a little bit more about John Berg. He was in Virginia in 1901. He decided to go west. So he and two friends got in a sort of a, I don't know, train or whatever, and they stopped in Montana, North Dakota, Idaho, and they'd wrestle along the way, get some money, and keep going. By the fall of 1901, he was in Spokane. He lived there for half of a year. He wrestled in Spokane, Colfax, Walla Walla. And then he moved to Seattle. He had to take a half a year off because his last match in Spokane, he hurt his arm so bad he couldn't move it. So it took a half a year off. He wrestled in Seattle, and then he moved up to Cedar-Woolley, and he wrestled in Cedar-Woolley in the summer of 1902, and then he moved up to Bellingham. And I don't know why, or Whatcom, I don't know why he moved here. I don't know what he did here, but he lived here for half a year before he wrestled. I just know that he ended up in Whatcom. Now, the person he's wrestling against is Chris Person. He was a heavyweight amateur champion down in Oakland, California, and he moved up and became a longshoreman up in Tacoma, and he had wrestled sort of in the Northwest, Portland and so forth, and they decided to have a championship match and call it the Northwest Championship. You'll notice there's a $100 side bet and percent of the gate. Now, a side bet means I have to put up $100, you put up $100, the winner takes the $200. So you had to sort of bet on yourself in order to wrestle. That's what a side bet means. And then the percent of the gate varied sometimes between 50 and 75%. You'll see there are different weights. They wrestled down in Tacoma. At the time, Berg was living up in Whatcom, and he beat him in 2 falls easily. At that time, in the Whatcom newspaper, they wrote the following: "It has recently again come into great prominence in this country, and justly, for it is one of the cleanest and most scientific of athletic contests. It is a game that requires muscular development, but is conservatively undertaken. It gradually builds up the required physique and makes the body and mind aggressive, nimble, and active. The general public is now rather ignorant of the fine points of wrestling, but it furnishes an excellent diversion for the spectator, even if he does not understand the holds. As they are all easy to follow with the eye, and the strenuosity of the contest arouses the highest enthusiasm of those in the audience." That's the first mention I found in any Bellingham newspaper of wrestling. At the previous match, as soon as that was over, a guy by the name of Professor Frank Lewis challenged Berg to a match. And it turns out he wrote a book called The New Science of Weaponless Defense. He lived in Spokane, where he was a physical culture director of a gym. And it's a little bit strange because it turns out that John Berg wrestled Frank Lewis over in Spokane in 1901. But when Frank Lewis came over here to wrestle him, he was interviewed by the newspaper, and he says, "Oh, I hear he's a pretty good wrestler. I look forward to facing him." That's the first sign of a scam. When you find out that he had wrestled him a year earlier. In fact, they had wrestled twice. It turns out Frank Lewis is the one who wrecked John Berg's arm. Okay. It turns out in this particular match, John Berg won easily, and the newspaper called it the cleanest, the cleverest, and fastest wrestling match that had ever been held in Bellingham. Turns out it was the first one, so it's fairly easy to be done. Okay, on the right is the very first big ad I found in the newspaper. And you'll notice a double wrestling match. On the left, you'll see that it's John Berg versus a guy by the name of Unfrad, who happened to be from Montana. He's called the Big German. And then Chris Person was the person that he just wrestled down in Tacoma. And then Frank Lewis was a person he just beat up in Bellingham. And so they just sort of hung together. And it was a double match. That's a picture of Frank Unfrad, the German strong boy. Notice the difference in weight of 25 pounds. Before the match, the Whatcom newspaper said that the matches are square. Now, square means that it's up on up. Okay? That the matches are square is not doubted. They are all modest and well-behaved men who love the sport and altogether form better and cleaner representatives of the old-time honored game that have appeared before the public for some time. Then they made a comment about the 700 people who attended the match. Anxiously, the spectators awaited the final bout. Judges were in whispered conversation with prosecuting attorneys. Sheriffs were hobnobbing with captains of police. Lawyers were earnestly discussing the fine points with doctors. Real estate men, livery stable proprietors, marble cutters, men's furnishing goods men, newspaper men, proprietors of wet goods, laundrymen, contractors, butchers, cigar dealers, fishmongers. In short, every trade and business was represented in that earnest communing preceding the finale. Turns out that Person beat Unfred in 2 falls. So far he hasn't lost. At the end of the match, the newspaper says, Pandemonium, shouting, cheering, whistling, throwing of hats in the air, but feebly described the scene that followed. A crowd rushed for the victor, raised upon the shoulders of less brawny but enthusiastic admirers. Berg was borne to the footlights, thanked the audience for their hearty congratulations. He scarcely showed terrible ordeal which he had just been through. So they really got excited at the meet. At the meet, another guy stood up and challenged John Berg, and his name was Emil Klank. And he said, I'm the Northwest champion. He was from Omaha, and he was the Northwest champion because when he wrestled, there was no Northwest out here. It was the Northwest back there. And so he called that he was the Northwest champion. So he said, somehow we got to rectify this. So next slide. Berg says, I will fight this Emil Klank, but I have to fight Lewis first, because Lewis claimed that the first time he fought him, he was out of shape. And so they had another fight, and it turns out that Berg beat him easily. It occurred on July 4th. The reason it was delayed a little bit is because in the previous match, Berg got what's called a rising in his ear, which is a boil, and he couldn't fight. And so they had to delay it. It's part of the big 4th of July celebration that was put on at the fairgrounds, and it was just a huge thing. Lewis lost weight by running 15 miles every day, and then he also had run out to Lake Whatcom, row for a while, and then run back, and he lost enough weight that he could fight, but he still lost the match. Now we're to Berg and Klank. You'll notice on the left that now Berg has a calling card. And it says, champion wrestler of the Pacific Northwest, open to meet all comers, physical culture instructor. He ran a school here in Bellingham. And notice his permanent address is Whatcom, Washington. And on the right, you'll see Emil Klank, 178 pounds. Emil Klank was a former policeman in South Omaha, and he had fought Berg twice in Spokane. Then he came here, and he had a chest size of 53 inches, if you can figure that out. It was well developed. And the newspaper focused on that, and so they said, it is particularly desired that the ladies turn out to see this match, as it will be a scientific display which may, with propriety, be seen by the ladies. Now, a previous article said that if any ladies show up, we'll make sure that the guys wear shirts. They didn't want them to be bare from the waist up. The attendance of women at the last match was greater than either of the previous ones, and it'll increase as they come to understand more fully that the game is void of brutality. The winner was Berg again. Then all of a sudden, you're going to see a pattern here. A guy by the name of Tom Davies stood up and challenged Berg to a match. Davies was the Canadian champion. Another guy named Frank Coleman stood up, and we should be honored because we have actually a relative of Frank Coleman in the audience tonight. But Frank Coleman stood up and challenged him, and he was the middleweight champion of America. He was from Omaha as well. Berg says, okay, both you challenge me. I want you two to fight, and whoever wins will get to fight me. And they agreed to that, but then when they had the match, it turns out Davies didn't show up. Coleman showed up, so he was the one who got to fight Berg. There's Frank Coleman. Again, Berg's, you notice 5'10". You'll notice these constant poses like this. That's how they push their muscles out. So you'll see that as we go along here. Okay. Now, Coleman was from Omaha. He was a wrestling tutor for a school back there. He had shoulders like a giant, a back and arm development that branded him as a hard man to handle in a wrestling match. And his specialty was using his feet and his legs. He kicked out of a lot of moves. Turns out Berg won 2 out of 3 falls. If you care, he used the body lock, the crotch hold, and the hammer lock, if that makes any sense. The referee was Emil Klank, who had fought before. You can see these names going back and forth. So now Berg is the middleweight champion of America. At that match, there was a challenge. You see the pattern? And the challenge was given by a guy by the name of P.D. McKellar, who was a Bellingham businessman. He ran the Bellingham Railway. He built the Seaholm Hotel in 1902. He actually lived there. He owned land, several mines up in Alaska during the Klondike days and so forth. And so he issued this challenge on behalf of Frank Gotch. I should say that the challenge was the way that you would get advertising out there. Because if you could get more people at the match, then you would get more percent of the gate. And also, there's a lot of betting that would occur. Now, most of the matches were 2 out of 3 falls. You'll see eventually that they become 3 out of 5. And the reason they like more falls is that between every fall, you would bet and the odds would change. And so part of the scam was that good wrestlers would lose 2 falls And then all of a sudden, everybody would bet on the other person, and then they'd win the next 3. And so, I mean, it was really a scam that was going on. Okay, so here's John Berg versus somebody else. Now, it wasn't the guy who just had the DeFi. That was Frank Gotch, was the one in there. It's a guy named Duncan McMillan. He's age 41 at the time. He was called the world's 5-style champion. Now, 5-style meant that he would fight 3 out of 5 falls, and every fall would be a different style. Remember the styles at the beginning? Every one would be different. And that's how he was the champion with that. It was a handicap match, which is a little bit strange. It doesn't say that there, but notice ladies especially welcome. But the handicap match meant that it went 1 hour, and he had to throw him twice in that hour. McMillan did, because he's a bigger guy. If he didn't throw him twice in that hour, then Berg would automatically win. So it turns out in the match, McMillan threw Berg in about 24 minutes. And of course, a lot of betting occurred. And then it turns out for the rest of the match, Berg just sort of ran around and just avoided him. Because if he gets through the hour, you win. And he won. Okay. This is a mystery slide. This is a key to my finding why this is a scam. And you'll see this slide later on. But notice September 4th, a guy named Jay Anderson. Finally, Clank fought Coleman. So remember, Clank came, he lost to Berg. Coleman came, he lost to Berg. Now these two are fighting to see who's better. I will give you a little advance. It turns out these people have been fighting for 5 years back in the Midwest before they came out here. Okay. It also says Frank Coleman of Worcester, Massachusetts. He is from Omaha. His parents did not want him to wrestle. So when he left Omaha, he changed his name to Martin Lewis. I have 9 different names that he wrestled under. It is really hard to follow these people because they kept changing their names. But I know his pose fairly well, so when I see his pose in a different name, I know who it is. Okay, so these two fought. It turns out that it was a brutal brawl. And Coleman was booed and hissed and stuff like that. And all of a sudden, he'd just stop the match and go and address the audience and say, "You can't boo me." And then he'd go back and start beating on the guy again. And he ended up winning 2 out of 3 falls. And he was now, he called himself the new middleweight champion again. He had returned it. So this is the Frank Gotch, the one that P.D. McKellar had challenged Berg on. What he did, he says, "I'm not going to fight Berg. I'm going to fight both of these guys." Now, he didn't fight him at the same time. What he had to do was he had to fight one, and then that one, when he pinned him, the next one would show up, and they had to pin him, and the next one would show up, and they had to pin him. He pinned all 4 people within 9 minutes. The 4 people, because he did each one twice. Actually, he did it in about 80 minutes is when he finished. On the lower right, you'll see I put a little ad there, and the reason why is that all of a sudden, Bellingham or Whatcom was getting national press, and that's important. Notice it's in Decatur, Illinois, but because he had beat these 2 people. This is probably the most interesting character, or one of the more interesting ones. His name is Farmer Burns, really Martin Farmer Burns. He was a world middleweight champion, and he wrote a letter from Iowa. He was in a town of 60 people in Iowa called Big Rock, to Whatcom, saying he is frustrated. So Farmer Burns has written a letter to the Times from his home at Big Rock, Iowa, in which he says some interesting things about the wrestling game. Burns says he's noticed that the woods out here are full of so-called champions. He quietly remarks that it is strange what championship bees some of these dub wrestlers get into their heads once they find themselves far away from home, and the farmer is right. Skip down to the bottom paragraph. Now, if some of these so-called champions, possibly champions, ex-champions, and would-be, never will be, and never was champions, who according to Whatcom wish to meet the real article, they have their chance. And so he basically was challenging anybody who wanted to wrestle, he would come out here and do it. Okay? Finally, Frank Gotch got to fight John Berg. Now remember, John Berg had not lost yet. Okay? And this was the big match. $1,000 side bet. 75% of the gate, plus there was $3,500 in other side bets. This is 1903. A lot of money. It turns out it was a handicap match. The Gotch had to throw him twice in an hour. And so it was a pretty dangerous proposition, but Gotch weighed quite a bit more. A little bit about Gotch is he came from Humboldt, Iowa, and I don't want to tell you too much. He traveled out here actually with Duncan McMillan and a manager by the name of Joe Carroll. You'll hear his name as well. This is a picture of a restaurant in a barn out by Alger, Washington. As soon as he beat Berg, which was tremendous because now he became the Whatcom's favorite. Berg had been the Whatcom's favorite before that. He issued a declaration. He says that he's willing to wrestle any man in America under 211 pounds for $2,500. Tom Jenkins, the American champion, is preferred. And that's painted, hit it again please, that's on that barn in the back is his challenge. Now I can't find where that barn is in Alger, but I think it's great that 3 miles from my house there was this big advertisement. So, okay. So before he went on to other people, he fought McMillan. Remember McMillan had fought Berg? You should start hearing some of these names over and over again. What he didn't say was he just fought McMillan 2 weeks earlier in Spokane on their way out here, and they pretended they didn't know each other. Farmer Burns stood up at the match, so he came out here from Iowa, and he challenged Gotch to a match and said he'd wrestle him. I should show you that there's other things going on in the hotel at the same time, or in the theater at the same time. These are activities that were occurring on two sides of the wrestling meets. Everything from plays to concerts to everything. So you can imagine in this one theater hall, all these things would occur. Now we have the match between Burns and Gotch. And I'll tell you a lot more about these two guys because they're my main two guys in a moment. But Burns was interviewed by a Tacoma reporter. And he says, the reason for my endurance at my age, he was 43 at the time, is I believe because I don't drink intoxicants, tea or coffee, or chew, smoke, or swear. You may wonder how abstaining from profanity can affect endurance. But it's true, for swearing causes the temper to rise, producing an agitation that it means a direct loss of energy. So that's why he attributed the fact that he could last so long. Now it turns out that Gotch learned how to wrestle from Burns back in Iowa. Burns ran a school, and you'll see that in a moment, and Gotch was one of his pupils. At the end of the match, Burns won. It was a real surprise because everybody expected, Gotch beat Berg and he beat the two people before that. Now he was going to be the winner all the time. And all of a sudden Burns comes out here and he beat Gotch. And the news reporters thought something is up. And they wrote the following. Some curious things occurred during the match. Everybody saw that the farmer was not anything near as fast as Gotch. In 12 mix-ups, Gotch took Burns to the mat 11 times. And when Burns did take Gotch to the match, it was because Gotch just backed up to him and let him get a hold. Then he didn't stay under Burns as long as a half pint of whiskey would last a six-handed poker game. Unquestionably, Gotch could have taken Burns to the mat and laid him. So there's something suspicious going on there. When that happened, they usually felt, it just means there's going to be another match and then they'll get more money at that match. That was sort of what the intent was. At this match, a guy by the name of Dave Butler, who was a miner up in the Yukon, showed up, and he pulled out $20,000 in money and challenged Burns to say, I want you to fight again in a week. And Burns said, no, I won't do that. Okay, I'll let you in a little bit. Butler and Burns were also very good friends. It was a setup, so, okay. This is the manager for Frank Gotch. His name is Joe Carroll. Very evil guy, you'll find out at the end. He should have wore one of these little handlebar mustaches, that you twirl, the type of thing. But he fought John Berg. They felt sorry for John Berg because he'd been the champion and then he lost to Gotch. So they'd set up matches to make him feel better. And so they wrestled them, and notice Carroll had to throw him twice in an hour, and Carroll got the first fall, and then Berg ran away from him again and won. Okay, so he repeated his little strategy. This P.D. McKellar was fairly well known in Bellingham. He wanted wrestlers to be more exposed to females in Bellingham. So he organized a charity night at the theater with all the wrestlers invited there and women only. And they're trying to raise money for building an annex. They needed $10,000, and the wrestlers volunteered their time. John Berg in the upper left, then Joe Carroll in the middle, then Farmer Burns in the upper right, Frank Gotch in the left, Duncan McMillan, and then the new guy you haven't heard about is Tom Davies. And you'll hear more about him as we go along. But they all did exhibitions. They wrestled, they boxed. Tom Davies' wife was a former acrobat in the circus, and so she did some things like that. John Berg lifted weights, impressed all the ladies. They didn't wear shirts. They were really hunks, coming out there type of thing. And you'll notice that they made $135. Now compare that $135 to the matches where they have $1,000 side bets. I mean, they didn't earn very much money at all. So John Berg then took on Farmer Burns. And because remember, Burns would not fight Gotch. And it was, he had to throw Berg 3 times in an hour. And they got lots of people there. The Whatcom newspaper said, Bellingham is still the mecca of the wrestlers. While many of the good men of the game have already come and gone, others of almost equal ability and reputation have had their attention drawn to this place, and challengers have again commenced to come in. Eventually, Bellingham is getting a great deal of advertising from this source. So you see what I mean by Bellingham didn't care. Burns won, and then he said, oh yeah, I'll fight Gotch. Okay. Gotch wanted to do it for $1,000. Burns only wanted to do it for $250. And notice that it ended up being $1,500 in side bets between the two of them about the match. Plus they got a percent of the gate. And the quote on the bottom is kind of interesting because it says, all the wrestlers are flocking and matching. Burns is there. He and Gotch have been matched to meet for $1,000 a side. Notice the date of the newspaper article is 12/15 and the match is on 12/10. So the newspapers are a little bit behind. They didn't have the internet to keep track of things at that time. Some people said it would be the greatest wrestling contest that has ever taken place on the Pacific Coast, and as great as any that's ever taken place in America. Turns out that Gotch won. You're probably not surprised. Okay. Gotch won. At the end, Burns said, I'm not ashamed to be thrown by Gotch, for I consider him the best man in this, if not any country. I think a great deal of him, but if I were wrestling with my brother, I would do all I could to win. Burns then left and went back basically to Iowa to wrestle. At that match, a guy stood up, a reporter stood up and read what's called a defy or a challenge from Tom Jenkins, who's the current champion. And he said, I will accept your challenge to come out to Bellingham or Whatcom and wrestle. That's exactly what Gotch had wanted. So that was in the process of being set up. To kill some time, because that match didn't occur till the end of January, they had to have wrestlers to keep the audience. So they brought in a guy by the name of Chief Two Feathers from Montana. And he was a Kootenai Indian, but he lived on the Flathead Reservation. He was tall and majestic, looked like an Indian braid. He always wore a full dress, appropriate to a chief. They did all kinds of things. They'd put blankets and feathers on him, and they'd put him on a horse and lead him around Bellingham, because he was this big Indian wrestler. They had a play that was going on 2 days before the wrestling match, and between Act 1 and Act 2, he got up and did a rain dance. I mean, they were really misusing the culture aspects of this. It turns out that Gotch defeated him at 2 straight falls, but it was a very tough match. Gotch earned $1,160 in side bets. And the prelims, turns out it was Joe Carroll versus Jack O'Neill, who happened to be the manager for the chief. At the same time, December 17th, so it's a couple days earlier, was the first match held in Vancouver, in wrestling there. And that was between 2 names, John Berg and Tom Davies. So they were sort of spilling over into the local area. John Berg fought a guy by the name of Young Yusuf. Now, in wrestling from 1890 to about 1930, big Turks were the big thing. Great, big, huge people that they would come and fight. And so this was Young Yusuf. He's known as a horrible Turk. And he claimed to be the first non-white man to fight in Bellingham, which I thought was interesting because it was a week after they'd fought Chief Two Feathers. Okay. Berg won the match. He won a side bet of $500. And what's interesting is that the Turk's real name was Bob Maganoff, and he was a miner from Montana. And he dressed up like the big Turk. So you see the scam as we go along. Okay. Now Tom Jenkins is going to come here. Everybody's excited. 4 people were responsible. A guy by the name of McKellar, who we've mentioned before. There's also a guy by the name of Henry Wolcott, who was a real estate agent. A guy named A.J. Giles, who's a lawyer. And A.C. Senker, who was the manager of the cigar store at Beck's Theater. And the 4 of them put up the $2,000 to guarantee if Jenkins would come out and fight. Jenkins is in the lower right. And you'll see on the right-hand side there just how everybody is sort of agog with everything that's going on. The Whatcom newspaper said the Jenkins-Gotch match here will be the first World Championship wrestling match ever pulled off on the Pacific Coast. It will be an event that will excite interest all over the country, and visitors will come from all parts of the world, thus doing much to advertise the name of our new city. Because the match is going to occur in January after it becomes Bellingham. Okay, next slide. They still had to kill time, but they didn't use the Beck's Theater, so wrestling would occur in other places in Bellingham called the Bellingham Theater. You'll see Tom Davies is there. They had a Japanese wrestler. They had the wrestling Gladiators. Notice the names, Chief Two Feathers, McMillan, O'Neill Davies. The names, the same group, just sort of stayed here. Now, I have to take a step back and look at some things. Why is this fight so important? Who are all these wrestlers? How are they interconnected, and what's the scam? Frank Gotch, you see when he was born in 1878 near Humboldt. At age 21, he lost to a guy by the name of Charles Andrews. That was his second professional match. It occurred in Laverne, Iowa on a cinder racetrack. He was a furniture dealer. And that's the description in the newspaper. The Woodman picnic at Laverne last week was a grand success. A large delegation from Humboldt attended. Humboldt won the tug-of-war banner, but our wrestler Gotch went down before an imported professional. It took the importation an hour to put Gotch on his back. It actually was 2 hours. At the end of the match, Gotch's back was just rubbed raw from the cinders on the track. He was bleeding all over the place. It turns out that Charles Andrew was actually a guy by the name of Dan McLeod, who was the current champion. He pretended he was a furniture dealer because he thought he could make some money. Okay? I mean, these guys were crooked. Okay? There's a picture of him. It turns out that this is a weird little article, on August 3rd, 1899. So it's a month or 2 months after the other article. It claims that this Dan McLeod came to Humboldt, Iowa, and wrestled in private where nobody could come to it except for the 2 wrestlers and Farmer Burns. And people still wonder if that's true because it says Dan McLeod there, but another person who's a historian in wrestling says that it wasn't McLeod, it was a guy by the name of Jenkins, who you'll hear about in a moment. McLeod is so impressed with Gotch that he says, "Oh, you're a good wrestler. You should go work with Farmer Burns." So that's what he did. Farmer Burns, you'll see when he was born, he lost to Evan Strangler Lewis in 1886. Stranglehold. This is the guy who invented the stranglehold. Burns was so disappointed, he says, "I'm going to beat this guy." So he went home and he worked on his neck. Each night he would lie there with a bag of 25 pounds of rifle shot on his neck and sleep every night. His neck got so strong that he would travel with the circus. They'd put a noose around his head, tie his legs apart, drop him down, and he'd whistle Dixie while he went down 6 feet. And then he'd walk away. And they actually did scientific experiments with him that they proved that he could never be hung because his neck was so strong. This is him at age 66. He still had the neck muscles. Okay? See, weird stuff when you look this up. He won the rematch after he strengthened his neck. He became champion of America. Then he was defeated by the furniture guy, Dan McLeod. Then he was defeated by Tom Jenkins, who's this guy who's going to come out to Bellingham. He fought over 6,000 matches. He claims he never lost 10. So 9 or less is what he lost. He opened a wrestling school. He had a mail order course. You can find that mail order course, parts of it, on eBay if you're really interested. So here's Gotch with Farmer Burns. They met in Fort Dodge. He went and did sort of a test run, and he had to spend 15 minutes with Farmer Burns, and Gotch only lasted 11. Burns was so impressed, he said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I've never met an amateur wrestler the likes of this fellow in my life. If Gotch will travel with me, I'll make him champion of America." So he took him under his arm. He developed a special hold called the toe hold. Burns then sent him to wrestle in Dawson City up in the Yukon. He became the Klondike champion. He came home with $35,000 in 1901 for 6 months' work up there. Just imagine, at that time. He came back to Iowa in 1902. He won the Iowa Heavyweight Championship, then Nebraska, then Illinois, and then Kansas. In 1901, November, Tom Jenkins defeated Dan McLeod. These 2 names are going to be in there. So now Jenkins is the winner. But then in 1902, December 25th, Dan McLeod defeated Jenkins. Okay? So Frank Gotch had to somehow fight Tom Jenkins in order to get to McLeod, who was now the champion. So he went to Cleveland, Ohio, 6,000 spectators, a fierce battle. Jenkins' friends were there. They kept yelling, "Cut the Iowa hog's head off," was the cheer that the crowd would have, because he was a farmer from Iowa. And it turns out Gotch lost. It was unfair. He was put in a stranglehold. And finally the referee said, "No, you can't do that. It's a legal hold." So he let go, and then he put him in a stranglehold again. If you ever watch professional wrestling, you've seen this where they go back and forth. Finally, Gotch was reeling all over, and he pinned him. And that was the end of the match. Okay, after the fight, Burns stood up and he said, within 2 years, he will throw Jenkins. Turns out it was within about 1 year. After he did this, Jenkins then defeated McLeod. So notice he just lost to Jenkins. He was fighting Jenkins to get to McLeod, but now Jenkins won, so now he had to fight Jenkins again. That was his goal. There's Tom Jenkins. Stranglehold was his specialty. At age 8, a toy fireworks cannon blew up in his face, broke his jaw. He lost one eye totally, and the other eye was partially blind. Which really made it strange because when he wrestled, he did this thing in front of the audience. He'd come into the thing and he'd take out his eye and put it in a little bag and put it on the side, and stuff like that. So he was a street tough kid. He was in jail a lot. He made tire irons for buggy tires and so forth. His name was Rough Tom Jenkins because he had rough hands that he'd strike across your eyes and they'd burn and stuff like that. It turns out that when he fought McLeod, P.D. McKellar happened to be in Buffalo at that time. So there's these connections that go all the way around. So now Gotch had to face him. Now the match is coming to Bellingham. It turns out Jeff Jewell has, I couldn't believe it, he has these two things in a file cabinet. They were original things placed in the theater showing who's going to be fighting. The newspaper said, Jenkins is a moose, strong and sturdy, appearing as an oak, and it's hard to imagine how anybody can defeat him. The lithographs around town do not exaggerate his muscular development the least. Okay, you look at his muscles. This is the poster. Notice it's $2,000 plus $2,000 side bet. Ladies especially invited. There had been cold weather and lots of snow, but finally it was 40 degrees. We're the day of the event. They had a special train coming up from Seattle that picked up people in Everett, Mount Vernon, also a train down from Vancouver. The people on the right are all of Gotch's team. You'll see upper left is Joe Carroll, his manager. Then is Emil Clank, Farmer Burns, McMillan, and then Tom Jeffries is on the lower right. Those were his sparring partners. And then a guy by the name of George Kennedy added to the team. He was a former world champion up in Canada who lost, became a promoter, eventually ended up buying the Montreal hockey team, and he helped start the NHL. So there's a lot of weird connections. Okay, so we're to the fight. None of you have ever seen this picture. I was back in Humboldt, Iowa a month ago, and I found it in Gotch's personal files. And it's just amazing that we were able to find this picture. But that's the match in Bellingham in 1904. Now, to describe the fight, you might want to close your ears on this, but the bout opened with Gotch the aggressor. Jenkins was good-natured and apparently decided to let Gotch wear himself out. I should say there was more than 3,000 people here. Some people went up in the rafters. 4 people fell into the ring during the fight. I mean, it just filled with people. The latter worked hammer and tongs, but Jenkins stuck to the man, refusing to be rolled over. After 45 minutes, Gotch got one of Jenkins' shoulders to the carpet in an effort to win the fall, shoved the big Ohio man all over the mat, outside of the ropes 3 times, whacking his head against the floor again and again until at the end of 15 minutes, Jenkins was not only down, but groggy and apparently exhausted. He had to be assisted from the ring for the customary 10-minute rest. For the second bout, Jenkins, who had recovered, changed his tactics, became the aggressor. The match became fierce. One man seemed as good as the other. The enormous crowd hooted when Jenkins was on top and cheered when Gotch seemed to have the advantage. The wrestlers were swearing at each other like pirates. After 20 minutes, both men were on their feet, each trying to beat the other one to their knees. Jenkins persisted in throwing his arm around Gotch's neck, bringing his wrist tight on the Iowa man's windpipe, thus forming a triangle. Each time Jenkins did this, Gotch reached up because he had long arms, and viciously jabbed Jenkins in the face. But Jenkins, who only had one eye, stood there 3 or 4 times after appealing to the referee. Then suddenly in a rage, he gave Gotch a shove and swung at him. And the referee stopped the fight because that was illegal. Okay. Later on, I should also that there's a lot of blood involved in this match. They said that everybody sitting within 3 rows was covered with blood. So I know, don't you love that part? Okay. At the end of the match, this is the headline in the local newspaper: Gotch wins a wrestling championship. After the match, Jenkins denied he had fouled Gotch, and he asked for a rematch, but later on, he admitted he had deliberately fouled him, and he said because Gotch was trying to gouge out one of his remaining eye, and he wouldn't risk that eye for all the wrestling purses in the world. So that's why he slugged him. This is back in the hometown in Humboldt, Iowa, 2 o'clock a.m. They published that. That's his picture in 1904, right after the match. He also got the cover of the Police Gazette. These are all the newspapers throughout the world, throughout the United States, really. Notice the middle one, probably a fake. This is the Bellingham Herald. Gotch and Jenkins wrestled last night. It is to laugh. This is the Ferndale Record, they said Barnum, the greatest showman who ever trod the earth, said that the American people like to be humbugged. A great many persons were emphatically reminded of this fact after visiting the big wrestling match at Bellingham last week. Linden's been affected with the wrestling mania. The Gem City is a way of keeping up with the precision. So that's what they said. 2 days later, everybody forgot about Gotch, because a guy by the name of the Russian Lion, the left-hand side, his name is Georg Hackenschmidt, fought the Big Turk over in England. The match lasted, I think, 30 seconds, because he broke the Big Turk's arm, and they just stopped the match. And so it turns out he was called the world champion. Now, you look at that body, I mean, would you want to wrestle that guy? So everybody forgot about Gotch because Hackenschmidt was a big name. Gotch wrestled around Bellingham for about 4 months, then he went back to Iowa. And he came back in August. He wrestled Dan McLeod, the furniture dealer, up in Vancouver and beat him. And then he had a weird match with a guy named AOY AGI. Turns out that there was this traveling group who was putting on sort of a vaudeville exhibition. They challenged the wrestlers, and they challenged Gotch especially. So Gotch faced that particular guy. 3 rounds. He had to sign a special statement saying that he would not hold the Japanese wrestler guilty if he was maimed, because he used jujutsu. And so Gotch signed it. This for $150. And it turns out Gotch pinned him 3 times in less than 30 seconds. all 3 in less than 30 seconds. Okay. He fought a guy named Dr. Ben Roller. He was a surgeon down at the University of Washington who got involved in some land speculation, and he lost money, so he had to make money, so he became a wrestler. And in 1906, he fought Gotch. It turns out that in the match, Gotch never pinned him once. Roller won. He won $4,000, and everybody said, this is a setup. There's no way. That was Roller's second fight. He said, there's no way that can happen. And so Roller wrote an article saying he'll never fight again. This is his last fight. 2 years later, they fought again. And Gotch won, and he won $5,000. Okay. Another guy he fought was Fred Beell, which is the last person who beat him. He was a little guy. He was from Wisconsin. He was a woodcutter. And he fought down in New Orleans. Turns out he was one of Farmer Burns' pupils as well in the 1890s. What happened in the match is Gotch won once. Beell won once, and then somehow Gotch stumbled, and he ran right in the corner and hit his head in the post and knocked himself out. And they didn't know what to do because he was the world champion. He was supposed to win. And so he stood up and he staggered back into the arena, and Beell didn't know what to do, so he pinned him. So now Beell's the world champion. And so 2 weeks later, they had another fight up in Kansas City, and he pinned him after 2 matches quickly. And so he got the world championship back. He never lost again. But these things happen. They did face each other 9 times. Gotch won 6 of the 9. He lost 3 times. He had to face George Hackenschmidt. You'll notice this quote at the bottom was that no Turks, Indians, Japanese were invited. It was a very nationalistic thing, Europe versus the United States. This is pictures from the fight. It turns out that in the first round, Hackenschmidt succumbed to the toe hold, and they got up, they went to their respective corners. The bell rang for the second one. Hackenschmidt came out and says, I don't feel like wrestling him anymore, give him the championship. And the newspapers went crazy that he did this type of thing. They had a rematch. It was in Comiskey Park, the side bet, over $80,000 involved, plus Gotch. They filmed it, and he got half the film rights, and it traveled around the United States showing the films, and he had the rights to that. Now, that match was even worse. It turns out that Hackenschmidt's trainer was this Dr. Roller. And about a month before the match, Roller did something to his leg, Hackenschmidt's leg, so Hackenschmidt couldn't use his leg. And they found a mysterious $5,000 in an account for Roller from Gotch's supporters. And then when they had the match, they asked Hackenschmidt, can you fight? And he says, yes, I have to. And they fought. And of course, Gotch put the toe hold on him right away and won. And that was the end of it. And so a lot of people got very angry. It's known as one of the matches that was really thrown. After the fight, he became world renowned. Advertisements, that's for women's shoes. A whiskey for a restaurant on the East Coast. He was one of the first people who had endorsements. We'll go through these fairly fast. He finally got married in 1911 to his childhood sweetheart. She was about 20 years younger than him. Okay. He started a vaudeville show that he traveled throughout the world on. His traveling partner was this Emil Clank, and it was a reenactment of the fight with Hackenschmidt, with blood and everything. He became very rich. You'll see at the right-hand side, he had 2 cigarette sports cards that if you're a collector of cards, they're worth a fortune. He wrote a book. Lots of pictures in the book, but you'll notice that Teddy Roosevelt wrote to him, "I wish you luck in your book on the life and mat battles of Frankie Gotch. I know Frank Gotch and think highly of him as an athlete and assistant. He's a square and honest fighter." We'll see how square he is in a moment. Okay, keep going. He bought an automobile dealership in Humboldt, Iowa. Next slide. He admitted that he's worth $100,000. When he died, he's worth $500,000. He died in about 1917 or something like that. Okay. Humboldt, Iowa, if you ever get there, it's in sort of central Iowa. There's a huge statue of him right by the creek where he did all his workouts. If you go to the left-hand side, you'll see a sign there. Bellingham is on that sign, saying that he won the championship out here. I spent a whole afternoon with the genealogist back there where they gave me all of his old family scrapbooks, and I got to go through them, so it was just a great experience. What happened to Tom Jenkins? Well, that's Teddy Roosevelt as a wrestler. He appointed Tom Jenkins to be the wrestling instructor at West Point. 2 of his best pupils were these 2 guys. Next slide. Next slide. Pat and Eisenhower were 2 of his pupils. Okay. Now we go to the scam. It's called Kafabi. It was a staged wrestling events portrayed as real, especially feuds and rivalries as being genuine and not staged. It's Pig Latin for kayfabe, which means be fake. Okay. These are the 3 people in the Klondike Scam. Remember, he went up to the Klondike and earned $35,000. Gotch, Burns, and March. Okay. Now, March had been up in Alaska in 1898, 1899. He made $14,000 wrestling. He came back with P.D. McKellar, came back with the 2 Butler brothers. They went to Iowa and they tried to get Frank Burns to go up to Yukon with him and rake in money. Burns says, "No, I'm too old to do that," so he sent Frank Gotch up there. It turns out that Joe Carroll went with, remember the guy at the very beginning, the old guy? That's McLaughlin. The 2 of them went up there as these world-class wrestlers, taking on anybody. They didn't identify with Frank Gotch. He went up there as a miner. He pretended he was from Missouri, and then he just come back from the Philippines in a war. And they didn't associate. And he just worked in a mine, James Brown's mine, and he'd listen to people in the bars, and whoever was the toughest person, he would take them on. He kept beating him, and he kept getting more and more people challenging him. The last match, he faced the Klondike champion, and he won $18,000 in that one match. Then he faced Joe Carroll. That's the 18,000. The last fight was in the Savoy Theater where he faced McLaughlin and Marsh. Nobody knew that they were in cahoots. People bet like crazy, and they didn't care because they just split the money at the end. Okay, now the Whatcom Scam. Same 3 characters, except they got the 2 names backwards there, Marsh and Burns. Why is it a scam? Well, all of these things on the right occurred before 1902. First one is Frank Gotch versus Frank Coleman. Remember his name out here? Then it's McMillan versus Marsh versus Burns. Marsh is the same as Joe Carroll. Then the right-hand side is Burns, Gotch, and Emil Clank. All of these people fought back there. Next slide. These are 3 articles talking about how they were fake. Sioux Falls was fake wrestling. Next one, the wrestlers, loud cry of fake. Oh, sorry, okay. Loud cry of fake greets Gotch. Burns, Gotch, and Marsh work of fake out west. I mean, they're being identified as a fake group. Next slide. These are all the fights I talked about here. Everybody in red was a winner. You'll notice John Berg kept winning, and then Gotch won, and then he lost to Burns, then he won again, and then all the way through. Okay, next slide. Where does this fit in, that mystery slide? Next slide. You'll notice that that was in September 4th. If you look on the left, there is no fight September 4th. So something's wrong. Keep going. This is from Gotch's book. Go to September 4th. You'll see he fought somebody by the name of Jay Anderson out in Bellingham, and he won. That fight never occurred. He got confused when he was writing his biography at the end. Actually, it turns out that Jay Anderson is John Berg. And they knew each other back in Chicago. Okay, next slide. This is John Berg and C.J. Anderson. Okay, there he's up in Duluth. There he's with this, traveling with, he's out in Whatcom and he's challenging Emil Clank. He's challenging Emil Clank again. This is before all the matches. Okay, next one. Now I've changed colors on you. Everybody in green knew each other before they came out here. The only two that I can't lock in are Frank Unfried, the German from Montana, and Chief Two Feathers. Those are the only two that I cannot make a connection between them. Otherwise, everybody knew everybody. Most of them were students of Burns in some particular way, or they'd fought over and over and over again. It's hard to read, but it says the history of wrestling in Seattle, Bellingham, Vancouver, Victoria, Tacoma, and all the northwestern cities has been a story of fakes all the way through. Men familiar with the game are authority for the statement that not 1 out of 10 of the contests held in the Northwest in the last 5 years has been on the square. Okay, next slide. Several years ago, the wrestlers sucked Bellingham as dry as a sponge. And those who were there on the inside of the game there say that no straight match was the exception and not a rule. Wrestling is a fine exercise and a good sport, but most of the professional wrestlers are so crooked that they have to uncoil to breathe. And they have only themselves to blame because the game is so rotten that it needs fumigating. Okay? Now, was Gotch crooked? Most people think that he's not. I now have this proof that he was. This is May 9th, 1904, so that's 4 months after he fought, 5 months. And he was fighting back in Iowa, in Des Moines, fighting a guy by the name of Doc Fillmore. If you go on the right-hand side, in the middle it says, Fillmore is a wrestler, there's no doubt about that. In a few years, I expect him to be such that I will almost have to ask odds when I wrestle with him. I've never seen him work, but Farmer Burns, who wrestled Fillmore here a few weeks ago, told me the other day that the Rockford boy was a mighty fast man. It turns out that Dr. Fillmore was Emil Clank. At this same time, Emil Clank was Gotch's manager. So in this article, he says, I've never seen him work. He worked with him every day. I mean, it was just ridiculous how they did this. Next slide. There's called the Fakers in Iowa. Turns out they did the same thing in Great Falls, Montana that they did out here. In September 24th, 1909, there was a big swindle called the Mayberry swindle, where they arrested a lot of people. There was 285 names on that list. Joe Carroll, Dr. Frank Lewis, Emil Clank, Frank Coleman. That's a guy by the name of John Craycock, who's also part of the group, but he wrestled out here afterwards. All of these were listed. They had warrants out for their arrest. Okay, next one. You don't want me to tell you what they did because they pretended they were dead. They were wrestling and one guy got killed. They pretended that. And so it was really a dangerous thing they were doing. But there's Joe Carroll in the Seattle News in the spotlight. He's arrested. Next slide. Go to the bottom part. If there's a wrestler who's not crooked, I do not know him, and I know all of them. If the men were to wrestle, would be on the square and settle their differences, how many hours entertainment would the public have? We've simply got to jolly the game along in order to keep up public interest. Okay. He ended up serving 3 years in prison, making license plates in 1904. Okay, from 1909 to 1912 about. Next slide. I have about 3 more slides. Okay, this is... You'll notice the guy on the left, that's John Berg, right? The guy on the right is Frank Coleman. Okay, they fought out here. February 9th, 1906. Look at the guy on the left. Now his name is Charles Hackenschmidt. He pretended he was the nephew of the George Hackenschmidt, the big wrestler. He went so far as going to New York, getting on a boat and pretending he was coming off so they could take pictures of him coming from Sweden so he could fight and stuff like that. Okay. Notice Frank Coleman is now called the Cascade Mountaineer because he had a gold mine over by Wenatchee. Okay, next slide. You might know the name Milton Harden, who is a wrestler from this area. Anybody recognize the name? Yep. Okay. Well, this is an interesting article from 1917. Owen Daly of Axtell, Nebraska, former lightweight heavyweight champion, was arrested today on a charge of willfully maiming Hilton, this should be Milton Harden, the city, to whom he forfeited the wrestling championship in a match here last night. Daly is accused of injuring his opponent by twisting his foot with a toe hold, which was Gotch's invention. He was put in prison because he couldn't pay the $1,000 bond. And finally, Milton Harden went and got him out. Next slide. Where did I get the idea for all these matches? It comes from the Lake Sandwich book. I'm doing research for it. One of the characters of the families we have in there is by the name of Gerard. And it turns out one of the Gerards is an F.F. Gerard. He was on Friday Harbor. He was a wrestler. And he would go train on Lake Sammamish and then fight here in Bellingham. And so when I discovered him, I started to work on an article for the, I don't know for where, but working on an article on him, and all of a sudden I discovered the World Championship match. So I hope you have some idea of the scam. I want to close with just one last little part. What were the side benefits that Bellingham gained? Fame on the national level. They had a lot of outside visitors, a lot of money coming in, plus they saw some good wrestling. Thank you very much.